Professor Marandi, it's great to be with you again today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Daniel.
Yes, and there is a lot to talk about, Professor Marandi, and I wanted to get right to it with regard to Iran. Now, there was, of course, the late October strike that Israel conducted on Iran. We can get into the details of this, but I also wanted to ask you about your assessment of the situation as Iran vows a strong retaliation. However, what seems to be happening, in my estimation, Professor Marandi, is that we are now at the stage where Israel and its U.S. backers have essentially declared war on Iran. These are direct strikes into Iranian territory. And I'm wondering not only your assessment of the overall situation, is Iran prepared for this, but also what do you make of the fact that now we have gotten to the point where there are regular attempts to violate Iran's sovereignty? Is Iran ready to keep upping the ante and to protect its sovereignty? Or, as the Western mainstream media has surmised, is Iran in trouble?
Well, we always have to keep in mind that the Western media is completely one-sided. It is deeply involved in spreading propaganda, and they literally said the same thing about the war in Ukraine. And we're now seeing that our predictions from day one have proven to be correct, and all the claims made by Western media, Western governments, think tanks, and elites have turned out to be very inaccurate, to say the least. So I think it's very important to keep this in mind when you are reading Western media uh, outlets or listening to Western politicians or so-called Iran experts in the West. They're obviously going to repeat the same sort of material that they've been saying over the last 2-3 years in Ukraine. The Israelis and the Americans have violated Iranian sovereignty for many years. The Israelis and the Americans carried out the world's first cyber attack on another country when they attacked Iran's nuclear program. A very dangerous act. It could have caused a lot of deaths and injuries, but fortunately, that was prevented. They also murdered a number of Iranian scientists. And when I say they, I mean Israelis with US support, because all Israeli operations are carried out with US and Western assistance. So, for example, in Beirut, all Western embassies are part of the intelligence gathering apparatus. Western NGOs are part of the intelligence gathering apparatus, and many Western journalists. They are part of it as well. So in Iran, the West helps the Israeli regime, and the United States in particular does. So when the assassinations took place, one of them was a colleague of mine. He was murdered in front of my wife. He was a professor at the University of Tehran. These were carried out with the support of the US because the United States allowed the Israelis to use the MEK terror organization that has bases across Europe. It is it is a cult that fought for Saddam Hussein against Iran during the 8-year war where Saddam Hussein invaded the country. And then after he was overthrown, they all went to Europe. They were in Europe and North America during the war, but afterwards they all moved there. They have a major base, for example, in Albania. These people were involved in the terror attacks. And then in Syria, during the dirty war, when the Americans and their regional allies and NATO and the Israeli regime were trying to overthrow the Syrian government, the Iranians, after 2013, sent officers to help. and to help fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the Israelis would bomb them. So this is nothing new. But until the bombing of the Iranian embassy, the Iranians had a policy of strategic patience. But when the embassy was bombed in Damascus, the Iranians decided to punish the Israeli regime to create deterrence, especially since when the Iranians took the case to the UN Security Council, the United States, Britain, and France, and Germany, they all supported the airstrike on the embassy, which is extraordinary, but true. And of course, Western media pretended as if everything is normal. So the Iranians, knowing that the West supports Israeli aggression and facilitates Israeli aggression, after all, they're the ones who give the ammunition, they give the weapons. The F-35s are, excuse me, the F-35s are American. All of the ammunition that the Israelis use, they are brought into Palestine with there's an air bridge, and ships are constantly taking weapons, and all of these are for free. The Israelis are not paying for any of these. The ammunition that they're using to slaughter Palestinian children, the West is paying for that. They're making the ammunition, and they give them as gifts to the Israelis so that they could slaughter women and children. So the ammunition used against Iran, they are all gifts that are given to the Israelis to use against the Iranians. So in Damascus, the Iranians saw that the West is behind the Israeli act and supporting it, so it had to create deterrence. That deterrence didn't last very long. The Israelis carried out an assassination in Tehran, murdering Ismail Haniyeh. The martyr Ismail Haniyeh was an official guest of President Pezeshkian, who was in Tehran for his inauguration, and he was murdered in an official guest house. So the Iranians had to retaliate again. So all of these were in response to Israeli acts of aggression, which were supported by the West. Again, when Ismail Haniyeh was martyred, Iran took it to the UN Security Council, and the West backed the Israeli regime. So Iran really has no option but to punish the regime itself, because the West is supporting these acts of aggression. Now, the big question is Iran capable? Iran has been preparing itself for a war with the United States ever since, well, before the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, but in particular after Iraq and Afghanistan, there was the invasion of these two countries. The Iranians worked very hard to prepare themselves for a possible American attack or invasion. Because the Americans had effectively surrounded Iran, back then Russia and China were much weaker, and the United States was much stronger. So the Iranians developed a very powerful missile defense capability. They also worked on radars and surface-to-air defense capabilities. And in general, the Iranian defense industry began to grow. But one of the things that the Iranians did was they developed new missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, and they stored them in underground cities, missiles and drones. So we have underground cities of both missiles and drones across the country. Why? Because Iran was preparing itself for an American invasion or an American attack. And so Iran knew that if the Americans attack, they would have to have very well protected underground bases so that the Americans couldn't destroy the drones and missiles. Israel is infinitely weaker than the United States. It is completely dependent on the West. Without their support, the Holocaust would end in days. And of course, therefore, it's not really in a position to engage in a fight with Iran. If Iran and Israel go back and forth, if they strike one another, the Israelis would definitely lose. So why is it that the regime is pushing in this direction? I think it's pretty clear that Netanyahu, he failed in Gaza, he expanded the war in the north, something that many of us were predicting all along. And we all believed that he would fail in the north, as he did. The West and the Israelis were very hopeful. Western embassies in Beirut, Western journalists in Beirut were gloating after the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. And it's very interesting that these Western journalists, they were loving it, because for almost a year, they had to watch the footage of the genocide in Gaza, and now they could distract attention away from it and suddenly turn the Israelis into some sort of protagonist. Of course, a protagonist that's invading a country in the north and attacking and murdering people in Beirut and assassinating leaders, and in doing so, killing hundreds of ordinary citizens. But they were gloating. But even then, as you recall, I was in Beirut and I was telling Western media that this is not going to weaken Hezbollah, it's going to strengthen Hezbollah. I'm sure they thought these were just empty words, but I thought it had to be said. Hezbollah, we see, they are winning on the battlefield. Israel has been unable to gain a foothold in southern Lebanon. In Al-Khiyam, they've been defeated. They've been trying very hard to push forward there, and Hezbollah has held its ground. It's extraordinary. It's unbelievable. The West is conspiring against Hezbollah in Beirut. They're using the Lebanese forces and other fascists to stab Hezbollah in the back. They're conspiring against the resistance in Lebanon, and yet because Hezbollah's situation has always been much more difficult than Hamas in a certain respect. Hamas controlled Gaza. Hezbollah does not control Lebanon. Hezbollah has very powerful enemies in Lebanon, such as Samir Ja'ja, the Lebanese forces. These are the same people who worked with Israel when they invaded Lebanon in 1982. They're the ones who, along with the Israelis, carried out the Sabra and Shatila massacre, where 4,000 innocent people were massacred in 36 hours. These people now are conspiring against Hezbollah. So while Hezbollah is being stabbed in the back, they are winning the battle on the border. I think it's a miracle. It's unbelievable how successful they've been, despite the losses, despite the assassinations. And so they've lost in Lebanon. So they have to, again, Netanyahu has to expand the war. In the case of Iran, I think Netanyahu he's not an idiot. I think he probably knows that Iran can defeat him. But in my opinion, what Netanyahu is trying to do is he's trying to draw in the Americans and to create a regional war, which, if that happens, then that will be devastating for the world. The Iranians will destroy American bases in the Persian Gulf. They will destroy all the oil and gas assets in the Persian Gulf, because those American bases are in countries that are rich in oil and gas. And if there's a fight between Iran and the United States, those countries are hostile. They're hosting American bases. They're responsible. And I think we've already seen what happened to Aramco a few years ago when those drones destroyed the complex. So it is very easy for Iran to wipe out. I mean, some in the West would say the United States is powerful. It would not be possible for Iran. It would be very easy for Iran. And I think the Americans, they failed in the Red Sea. Iran is infinitely stronger than Yemen. So I think, but Netanyahu doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't care about the global economy. He doesn't care about anyone's economy. He cares about Netanyahu. He doesn't even care about Israelis. He cares about Netanyahu. So I think my belief is that he's pushing for a regional war. But if there is an exchange between Iran and the Israeli regime, I think without a doubt the Iranians will have the upper hand, and we've already seen that. We've seen how easily Iranian missiles struck Israel, and we do not see any real evidence of Israeli success in Iran. For example, and I'm sure you've covered this before, and I don't want to go into great detail about the Israeli attack, but the Israelis said that they're going to carry out a massive attack and Iranians won't know what hit them. Well, when I woke up, it wasn't because of the Israelis, it was because RT and Al Jazeera contacted me. And Parchin, which was their target in Tehran, apparently, is to the east of Tehran. It's to the south. It's not very far actually from where I am. You can, if there were big explosions in Parchin, you could see it from here. If you don't actually see the explosion, you can see it from behind hills. And it's happened before. For example, in the past, there were accidents or there was a fire. People from the east of Tehran could see inside Parchin. There were no fires in Parchin. So the Iranian attack on Israel was highly successful. They couldn't stop the Iranian missiles. The Israeli attack didn't seem to be very successful. I have asked people, and it's quite clear that the Iranians shot down most of the missiles. Some of the missiles didn't hit targets, and a few did. 4 officers from the armed forces were martyred. They were a part of the air defense network, but beyond that, the Israeli regime failed. So, one of your listeners or viewers may ask, so why should Iran respond? Because the Israeli regime carried out an act of aggression. And if Iran doesn't respond, that will only encourage Netanyahu to attack again, because we know that the Americans and the Europeans will not yank hard on his leash. They are allowing him to carry out a Holocaust. They are allowing him to carry out genocidal attacks in Lebanon. And every time he's attacked Iran, they supported his attacks, whether it was on an embassy or in an official government guest house. So Iran has no option but to strike back at the Israeli regime.
Indeed, and you were talking about Netanyahu pursuing a regional war. Professor Marandi, there are already reports that Israel still has, according to the words of Netanyahu himself, still has wild fantasies of striking Iran's nuclear facilities. You mentioned that doing so, that this regional war that Israel, backed by the United States and the West, this regional war that they are provoking would be catastrophic. What exactly do you feel like Iran has in store for Israel as it moves up the escalation ladder? Because from up until this point, Iran has been very judicious, very strategic, and very careful to send a message without causing massive amounts of damage. It seems like the time for that approach may be running out if Israel continues on this path. What do you say about that?
Well, Iran can fire, from my understanding, almost 2,000 missiles and drones in a single wave. And Iran can fire wave after wave. And the underground missile bases are across the country, and they're full. So the Israeli regime is a very small regime. Iran can easily devastate it. It's not something that would be very difficult for Iran. I think the Iranian response will be substantial because the Israelis carried out an attack on Iran. I don't know. I think it will be more devastating than the previous attack, significantly more devastating. But if the Israeli regime responds, the Iranians can go much further, and they can go on, and they can do it very swiftly. So I don't see a path to victory for the Israeli regime. If they strike Iran's nuclear program, I think Dr. Kharazi again made a statement saying that Iran's nuclear doctrine will change. First of all, I should add that all of Iran's strategic assets are deep underground, whether civilian or military, just like the underground missile and drone bases are well protected and cannot be destroyed by the Israelis. The factories that produce them cannot be destroyed by the Israelis. The Iranians have put all of its key assets deep underground. On the surface are small workshops that are spread out so that it would be difficult to strike them, but none of them are the key components of Iran's defense program. And I should add that the same is true, by the way, in Syria. Syria's key assets are deep underground. When the Israelis bomb, they don't bomb key assets because they don't have access to them. Or when they bomb Hezbollah, except for the assassinations, we've seen now, if you recall, I think I've discussed this before, that Hezbollah has thousands of kilometers of tunnels under Lebanon. Well, now we're seeing how they work. They've been using those tunnels to defeat the Israeli regime across the border with Israel. Remember, this is the Israeli regime that was able to take Beirut, to reach Beirut in 1982 in 4 or 5 days. Now, after well over a month, they haven't been able to cross the border. So Iran's assets are underground. Iran's nuclear program is underground. If the Israeli regime attacks Iran's nuclear program, it can't do much damage, nor can the Americans, but it would change Iran's nuclear doctrine. That will happen. Iran will change its nuclear doctrine. That's something that the West has to be very careful about. They're in no position to do anything about it. In addition to that, the Iranians have also shifted their doctrine on missile defense. Because as long as the West is continuing to support the Israeli regime to attack Iran, and the Israeli attack on Iran was facilitated by the Americans in Iraq and Syria, then Iran's missile range, the range of Iran will extend the range of its offensive missiles. So the West is only creating a greater crisis for the world. Some may say, well, why is Iran, moving towards escalation? If Iran does not respond to Western aggression, then they will become more aggressive towards Iran. And we have to always keep in mind, the West is willing to wipe out the Palestinian population. The West, the collective West, London, Paris, Berlin, Washington, all of the EU, the Canadians, the Australians, New Zealand, they are all fully prepared to annihilate the whole Palestinian population, because that's what they're doing. Their support. If this Holocaust continues for 1 more year, 2 more years, do you think that Western policy, these people in power, they will change their policy? Do you think the BBC will change its tone? Do you think Western elites will? They will continue to, media will continue to whitewash what they do. They'll try to justify what they do. And this will just continue until the last Palestinian is killed. And the same is true in Lebanon. The last Lebanese child is killed. So the West is prepared to liquidate the Palestinian population. We're seeing it. It's been over a year now. So the Iranians look at this and say, do you think they're going to be less ruthless towards Iranians if they have the chance? Do you think London or Berlin or Paris or Washington, they'll be less brutal towards Iranian children if they have the opportunity? So the Iranians have no option but to A, to protect themselves, and B, to punish their enemies. And I think it would be very wise for the Americans and the Europeans to rethink their policies. The Holocaust in Gaza has proven to us that the West is willing to go all the way in wiping out people, wiping out nations. And so nations have to be prepared. And Iran is not prepared to let go of the Palestinian people, to sacrifice the Palestinian people. It's not an option. Never was an option, and it's not going to be one. So Hezbollah, Iran, the axis of resistance, will continue to support Gaza and the Palestinian people, no matter how long it takes. And this is a heavy burden. This is a very heavy burden because it's Iran against the collective West. Turkey is not with the resistance. The Arab countries in the region are not with the resistance. They're all doing business with Israel. Some of them are pretending, like Erdogan, to be, supportive of Palestine, but he's not. He's closer to the Israelis than with the Palestinians. He's doing business with them. He's giving them cheap oil from Baku. So Iran is on its own, and so Iran is fighting this war or aiding the axis of resistance to fight this war in a very measured and calculated way. But at the same time, so Iran does not want a regional war, because a regional war would be a global tragedy. It would change your life, it would change my life, it would change the lives of people. No people's lives will remain untouched. And it will affect us for decades to come. It would be much worse than 1929. But the West is, again, the West is willing to annihilate the Palestinian people. They're more than willing to do it. So Iran has to be strong.